A poor black boy found a lost dog on New Year's Eve, but when the rich owner saw his grocery receipt, everyone in the mansion fell silent. Thomas sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, counting the coins spread out on the worn carpet. The metal pieces clinked softly as he sorted them into neat piles, quarters in one stack, dimes in another, nickels and pennies making smaller towers beside them. His fingers were cold. The heating in their third-floor apartment hadn't worked properly for weeks. $7.32, he mumbled, shoulders slumping. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for their New Year's Eve dinner. The yellow sticky note on the refrigerator caught his eye as he walked into the kitchen. His mother's handwriting was rushed but still managed to be neat. Asterisk morning baby, double shift today. Leftover mac and cheese in the blue container. Stay warm. Love you more than anything. Mom asterisk Thomas touched the note briefly before opening the fridge. The blue container sat on the middle shelf, next to a half-empty gallon of milk and some wrinkled apples. His stomach growled, but he closed the door without taking anything out. Better save the leftovers for tomorrow's lunch. The envelope had fallen partway out of the mailbox when he checked it that morning. Thomas recognized the logo of their building management company in the corner, and his hands shook slightly as he pulled it out. He'd seen enough of these notices over the past year to know what it meant. Notice of rent increase effective February 1st. Monthly rent will increase by $200. Thomas folded the paper carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. His mother didn't need to see this today. Not after yesterday's news about the gas station. He could still see her face when she'd come home last night, how the light had gone out of her eyes as she told him about the renovation plans. 6 months, she'd said, hands trembling as she hung up her coat. They're closing for at least 6 months of renovations. Mr. Peterson says he'll try to hire me back when they reopen, but she hadn't finished the sentence. She didn't need to. Thomas zipped up his coat and wrapped his scarf tight around his neck. The coin jar felt light in his pocket as he headed down the creaking stairs and out into the bitter Staten Island cold. Gray slush covered the sidewalks, and the wind cut through his thin gloves like they were made of paper. The discount grocery store was 6 blocks away. Thomas kept his head down as he walked, counting his steps to distract himself from the cold. The automatic doors wheezed open, bringing a blast of warm air that made his cheeks sting. "Hey there, Thomas," Mrs. Chen called from behind the register. She'd owned the store for as long as he could remember and always had a kind word for the neighborhood kids. "Shopping for your mama today?" "Yes, ma'am." He nodded, grabbing a red plastic basket. "Just getting some things for dinner tonight." He moved slowly through the aisles, checking prices carefully. Store-brand pasta, $1.29. 2 cans of tomato sauce on sale, 89 cents each. A small loaf of day-old bread, $1.50. In the produce section, he found some slightly bruised apples marked down to half price. The total came to $6.97. Thomas emptied his coin jar onto the counter, face burning as he counted out the money. Mrs. Chun waited patiently, pretending to organize receipts while he sorted through the coins. "Happy New Year, Thomas," she said softly as she handed him the plastic bags. "Tell your mama I said hello." The sun was already setting as he started the walk home, casting long shadows between the buildings. The grocery bags cut into his fingers, but he barely noticed. His mind was too full of numbers. $200 more for rent. 6 months without the gas station job. $7.32 in the coin jar. A quiet whimper stopped him in his tracks. Thomas almost missed it at first, dismissing it as the wind. But then he heard it again, a soft, pitiful sound coming from behind the dumpster in the alley beside Giovanni's Pizza. He took a few steps closer, grocery bags swinging at his sides. In the growing darkness, he could just make out a small shape huddled against the brick wall. Another whimper, and then the shape moved slightly. It was a dog, a small one with golden brown fur and floppy ears. It was shivering violently, pressed up against the wall as if trying to disappear. When it saw Thomas, it let out another quiet whine. Thomas noticed 3 things in quick succession. First, this wasn't a stray. Its fur, though dirty from the alley, was well-groomed, and around its neck was a leather collar with what looked like real silver hardware. Second, it was young, probably still a puppy, and absolutely terrified. Third, Hanging from the collar was a small silver tag that caught the last rays of sunlight, glinting like a star fallen to earth. The grocery bag suddenly felt much heavier in his hands. Thomas took 3 steps past the alley before stopping. The plastic bags cut deeper into his fingers as he stood there, caught between moving forward and looking back. Another whimper drifted through the cold air. "Not my problem," he muttered, shifting the bags to his other hand. "Just keep walking." He made it another 2 steps before his father's voice echoed in his head. "Character is what you do when nobody's watching, son." 3 years gone, and still those words could stop Thomas in his tracks. The dog hadn't moved when he walked back to the alley. It just watched him with big brown eyes, still shivering against the wall. "Hey there," Thomas said softly, setting his grocery bags down. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." He crouched down, keeping his movement slow. The dog's tail gave a tentative wag. "You lost?" Thomas reached out slowly, letting the dog sniff his hand. The leather collar was expensive, the kind his mother would never be able to afford. The silver tag dangled from it, engraved with an address and phone number. 124 Highland Avenue, he read aloud. His stomach dropped. Highland Avenue was in the north part of Staten Island, where all the mansions were. It might as well have been another planet. The dog finally crept forward, pressing its cold nose against Thomas's palm. Its fur was damp from the snow, and it was still shaking. Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. His mother's name flashed on the cracked screen. "Hey, Mom. Baby, good news." Her voice was breathless with excitement. "Mrs. Peterson felt so bad about the gas station closing. She gave me an extra hour off tonight. I'll be home by 7 instead of 8. Thomas looked at his watch, 5:45 p.m. Highland Avenue was at least a 40-minute walk in the opposite direction from their apartment. That's great, Mom. Everything okay? You sound strange." The dog had moved closer, leaning against Thomas's leg for warmth. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just finishing up at the store. Well, don't stay out too long. It's getting colder, and they're saying more snow tonight." "Did you find everything we need?" Thomas looked at the grocery bags, then at the shivering dog. "Yeah, I got everything. Such a good boy. See you soon, baby. Love you." "Love you too, Mom." The call ended, leaving Thomas alone with his choice. The dog looked up at him, tail wagging a little faster now. He pulled out his father's old pocket watch, the only thing he'd left behind besides memories and unpaid bills. 5:48 p.m. If he left now, he could make it home before his mother. The dog would probably be fine. Someone would find it eventually. But even as he thought it, Thomas knew he was lying to himself. "Your family's probably worried sick," he said to the dog, who responded by licking his hand. "And Highland Avenue isn't that far." "Not really." He stood up, grabbing his grocery bags in one hand. With the other, he gently took hold of the dog's collar. "Come on, then. Let's get you home." The dog seemed to understand, following close to Thomas's leg as they emerged from the alley. The street lights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the dirty snow. They walked north, past familiar buildings that grew progressively nicer. The dog kept pace well, though it still shivered. After 15 minutes, Thomas stopped and put down his bags. "Hold on," he said, unzipping his coat. The dog watched curiously as he pulled off his scarf. A Christmas gift from his mother 2 years ago. "You need this more than me right now." The scarf was worn but warm, and the dog stood still while Thomas carefully wrapped it around its small body. His fingers were getting numb, but the dog's grateful tail wags made it worth it. As they continued walking, the neighborhoods began to change. Small apartment buildings gave way to neat rows of houses. Chain-link fences became wrought iron. Cars parked on the street went from beat-up Hondas to gleaming BMWs. Thomas's arms ached from carrying the groceries, and his feet were wet from the slush. But the dog seemed more energetic now, recognizing familiar territory. At the entrance to Highland Avenue, an actual security booth stood beside the road. A guard in a dark uniform looked up from his phone as Thomas approached. "Can I help you?" The guard's voice was polite but firm. Thomas swallowed hard. "Yes, sir. I found this dog. Its tag says 124 Highland Avenue." The guard leaned forward, examining the dog and its collar. His eyes lingered on Thomas's wet sneakers and thin coat. "That's the Thompson residence," he said finally. "Through the gates, third right, big white house with black shutters. You can't miss it." "Thank you, sir." The guard pressed a button, and the gates swung open with a soft hum. As Thomas walked through, he heard the guard speaking into a radio. "Heads up, we got a kid walking in with the Thompsons' missing dog. Keep an eye on him." Thomas's face burned, but he kept walking. The dog trotted happily beside him, seemingly unaware of the cameras tracking their movement or the suspicious glances from passing cars. Highland Avenue was like something from a movie. Every house was massive, with perfect lawns and elaborate holiday decorations. Christmas lights twinkled from trees and roof lines, and fake reindeer stood frozen on snow-covered lawns. 124 was exactly as the guard had described, a huge white colonial with black shutters and a circular driveway. A wrought iron fence surrounded the property, with another security station at the gate. This guard was younger, with close-cropped hair and a suspicious frown. "Stop right there," he called out before Thomas could even speak. "Hands where I can see them." The grocery bag slipped from Thomas's numb fingers, hitting the ground with a thud. The dog pressed closer to his leg. I found the dog," Thomas stammered, heart pounding. "The tag says this is where it lives." "Don't move," the guard said, speaking into a radio. "Mr. Thompson, this is gate security. There's a boy here who claims he found your dog." "Should I?" "Yes, sir." "Understood." The guard lowered his radio, but kept his eyes fixed on Thomas. "Someone will be out shortly. Stay where you are." Thomas stood in the growing darkness, grocery bags at his feet, borrowed scarf still wrapped around the missing dog of a family rich enough to have their own security guard. His mother would be home in less than an hour, probably already planning their modest New Year's Eve celebration. And all he could think was, what have I gotten myself into? The grocery bags were already starting to freeze to the ground when the front door of the mansion opened. Thomas's fingers had gone completely numb, but he didn't dare move to pick them up. The guard was still watching him like he might try to steal one of the stone lions flanking the driveway. A woman in a crisp black uniform, some kind of housekeeper, came down the steps. Behind her, a tall man in a suit walked with the kind of confidence that came from owning things like private security guards and stone lions. "That's Max," the woman called out, pointing at the dog. "Mr. Thompson, it's definitely him." The dog, Max, apparently, wagged his tail but stayed pressed against Thomas's leg. The borrowed scarf was still wrapped around his small body. "Young man," Mr. Thompson said, his voice carrying across the yard, "where exactly did you find our dog?" Thomas's throat felt dry. "Behind Giovanni's Pizza, sir. On Warren Street." "Warren Street?" The man's eyebrows rose. "That's quite a way from here. And you walked all this distance?" "Yes, sir. I saw the address on his tag." Mr. Thompson turned to the guard. "Pat, call the police. We should file a report." Thomas's heart stopped. "No. I didn't steal him or anything. I just found him. He was cold and scared. And I dash. Calm down, son." Mr. Thompson held up a hand. "We're not accusing you of anything. But Max has been missing since this morning, and we need to know how he ended up in that part of town." The housekeeper had reached them now, and Max finally left Thomas's side to greet her. She knelt down, fussing over the dog. "He's not hurt," she reported. "Just cold and dirty." "What's this around him?" "My scarf," Thomas said quietly. He was shivering. Something softened in the housekeeper's face. "You gave him your scarf?" "I can take it back." Thomas reached down, but his numb fingers fumbled with the fabric. "Let's all go inside," a new voice called from the doorway. A woman stood there, wrapped in an expensive-looking cardigan. "It's freezing out here, and clearly, we have some things to discuss." Thomas glanced at his phone. 6:35 p.m. His mother would be home in less than 30 minutes. "I should really get going," he said, bending to pick up his grocery bags. One of the apples had rolled out onto the snow. "I just wanted to bring him home." "Nonsense," the woman, Mrs. Thompson, he assumed, said firmly. "You walked all this way in the cold to return our dog. The least we can do is hear the whole story. Patricia, please bring those groceries to the kitchen and put anything perishable in the refrigerator." Before Thomas could protest, the housekeeper had gathered up his bags and was heading inside. Max trotted after her, still wearing the scarf. I really need to get home. Thomas tried again. My mom's expecting me. Do you have a phone? Mrs. Thompson asked. When Thomas nodded, she continued, then call her. Tell her you're at 124 Highland Avenue, and we'll have our driver take you home afterward. Thomas thought about the rent increase notice in his pocket, about his mother coming home early, excited to spend a rare evening with her son, about how he was standing in front of a house that probably cost more than she'd earn in 3 lifetimes. But Max had stopped at the front door, looking back at Thomas with those big brown eyes. And really, what choice did he have? The inside of the Thompson house made Thomas feel like he should have wiped his feet 100 times. The floor was some kind of polished stone that reflected the light from a chandelier bigger than his bedroom. Everything smelled like pine needles and expensive candles. The study, I think, Mrs. Thompson said, leading the way down a hallway lined with paintings. James, could you ask Patricia to bring some hot chocolate? And see if Sarah is still on the phone with the police. Thomas followed her into a room that looked like it belonged in a movie about old English mansions. Bookshelves covered the walls, and a fire crackled in a fireplace big enough to stand in. Max had apparently beat them there and was curled up on a rug that probably cost more than their entire apartment. Sit, please. Mrs. Thompson gestured to a leather armchair. And call your mother. I insist. Thomas sank into the chair, trying not to think about his wet clothes on the leather. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed. His mother answered on the first ring. Thomas? Where are you? I'm about to leave work. Mama. He glanced at Mrs. Thompson, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. Something happened. I found a lost dog, and I had to bring it home. I'm at the owner's house now. You're where? His mother's voice rose slightly. Thomas, what are you talking about? Where exactly are you? 124 Highland Avenue, he said quietly. They wanted to ask me some questions about finding their dog. They said they'll have someone drive me home after. There was a long pause. Thomas could practically see his mother's face, could imagine her trying to process what he was telling her. Highland Avenue, she finally said. Baby, that's all the way on the north side. How did you even get there? I walked. You walked? Another pause. Stay right there. I'll come get you. Mrs. Thompson says they have a driver dash, Thomas James Williams. His mother's voice was firm now. You wait right there. I'm leaving now, and I'll be there as soon as I can. Text me the exact address again. Yes, ma'am. The call ended just as Patricia returned with a tray, holding a mug of hot chocolate and a plate of cookies. The grocery bags were nowhere in sight. Your groceries are safely stored, she said, setting the tray on a small table next to Thomas. Though I hope you don't mind, I took the liberty of putting everything in proper containers. Those thin plastic bags were falling apart. Thomas nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The hot chocolate had actual whipped cream on top, with what looked like chocolate shavings sprinkled over it. Now then, Mrs. Thompson settled into another chair, Max immediately moving to lay at her feet. Why don't you tell us exactly how you found our dog? So Thomas told them. About hearing the whimper behind the dumpster. About checking the tag. About making the decision to walk him home instead of leaving him there. He left out the parts about counting coins and rent increase notices. As he spoke, Mr. Thompson returned to the study. The police report has been filed, he said. They'll want to check the security cameras at businesses along Warren Street. See if they can figure out how Max got there. He's microchipped, Mrs. Thompson added. We should have him checked, make sure no one tampered with it. Thomas's hands tightened around the hot chocolate mug. I didn't steal him, he said again, his voice smaller than he wanted it to be. I can prove where I was. I have the receipt from the grocery store. It shows what time I was there. And dash, may I see it? Mrs. Thompson interrupted gently. Thomas pulled the crumpled receipt from his pocket, along with the rent notice he'd forgotten was there. He quickly stuffed the notice back before anyone could see it, holding out the receipt with a slightly shaking hand. Mrs. Thompson examined it carefully. 6:13 p.m. at Chen's Grocery. And you found Max shortly after this? Yes, ma'am. In the alley, right next to it. She handed the receipt to her husband, who studied it just as carefully. Something passed between them. One of those looks adults sometimes share that kids aren't supposed to understand. Patricia, Mrs. Thompson called. Could you bring those grocery bags back in here? Thomas's face felt hot. They were going to see exactly what he'd bought, See the cheap store-brand pasta and markdown apples. See exactly who he was. But before Patricia could return, there was a commotion at the front door. Voices in the hallway, footsteps approaching quickly. Thomas recognized his mother's voice before he saw her. "My son is here." Thomas Williams. He stood up just as she appeared in the doorway, still in her gas station uniform, her coat hastily thrown over it. Her eyes found him immediately, checking him over the way she always did when she was worried. "Mom," he started to say, but she crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled him into a tight hug. "Don't you ever scare me like that again," she whispered fiercely. Then she straightened up, keeping one hand on Thomas's shoulder as she faced the Thompsons. "I'm Marie Williams. I'm so sorry if my son has caused any trouble." And just like that, 2 very different worlds collided in a mansion study on New Year's Eve, with a lost dog sleeping by the fire and a half-empty mug of hot chocolate growing cold on an antique table. Marie Williams stood with her back straight, one hand still gripping Thomas's shoulder. Her gas station uniform badge caught the firelight. Marie W., assistant manager, in faded letters against blue plastic. "Mrs. Williams." Mrs. Thompson rose from her chair. "Please sit down. Your son has done nothing wrong." In fact, quite the opposite. Thomas felt his mother's hand tighten slightly on his shoulder. "I should get him home. We've taken up enough of your time, and it's getting late." "Actually," Mr. Thompson stepped forward, "we'd like to discuss something with you both. Patricia, could you bring another cup of hot chocolate for Mrs. Williams?" The housekeeper nodded and disappeared. Marie hesitated, then slowly sat in the chair next to Thomas. He noticed how she perched on the edge, like she was afraid to lean back into the expensive leather. "Your son," Mrs. Thompson began, "walked nearly an hour in freezing weather to return our dog. He even gave Max his own scarf to keep him warm." Thomas watched his mother's face. She was using what he called her work expression. Polite, careful, giving nothing away. "That was very kind of him," she said quietly. Patricia returned with another mug of hot chocolate, along with the grocery bags. She set them carefully by Marie's feet. "We took the liberty of repacking your groceries," Mrs. Thompson explained. The bags were falling apart from the snow. Marie glanced at the bags, then at Thomas. He could see the questions in her eyes, about the money he'd spent, about what these wealthy people must think of their meager New Year's Eve supplies. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. "That's very thoughtful." Max chose that moment to trot over to Thomas, still wearing the worn scarf. The dog put his head on Thomas's knee, tail wagging. "He seems quite attached to your son," Mrs. Thompson observed. "Max is usually quite shy with strangers." Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Williams, we'd like to offer a reward for returning Max. He's very important to our family." And no, Marie cut in, then caught herself. "I mean, thank you, but no. We don't need a reward. Thomas did what anyone would do." "Did he?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was gentle. "How many people would walk for an hour in the cold, carrying groceries, just to return a lost dog? How many would give up their own scarf?" Thomas felt his face growing hot. Under the coffee table, Max's tail thumped against the carpet. "Mom," he started, but she squeezed his shoulder again. "My son has a good heart," she said simply. "But we really should be going. At least let our driver take you home," Mr. Thompson insisted. "It's dark now, and they're predicting more snow." Before Marie could refuse again, Mrs. Thompson leaned forward in her chair. "While we wait for the driver, I'd love to hear more about you both. How long have you lived in Staten Island?" Thomas watched his mother's internal struggle play across her face. Her pride warring with practicality, her instinct to keep their lives private fighting against basic politeness. "All our lives," she finally answered. "Born and raised. And you work at?" Mrs. Thompson gestured at Marie's uniform. "Peterson's gas station. And I clean houses during the day." The words came out clipped defensive. "2 jobs." Mrs. Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. "That must be challenging." Thomas felt his mother tense beside him. This was exactly the kind of conversation she hated, rich people pretending to understand their lives. "We manage," Marie said flatly. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Even Max seemed to sense it, looking back and forth between the adults with perked ears. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat again. Sarah, Mrs. Thompson, perhaps we should dash. I'm looking for a new housekeeper, Mrs. Thompson said suddenly. Patricia is wonderful, but she's moving to Florida next month to be closer to her grandchildren. The position includes full benefits, of course. Health insurance, paid vacation, retirement plan. Marie went very still. Thomas could feel the tension radiating off her in waves. I'm not looking for charity, she said carefully. Neither am I, Mrs. Thompson replied. I'm looking for someone trustworthy, hardworking, and reliable. Someone who raised a son who would walk through the cold to do the right thing. The fact that you already have experience cleaning houses is a bonus. Thomas watched his mother's hands twist in her lap. He knew what she was thinking about the gas station closing, about the rent increase notice burning a hole in his pocket. The salary, Mrs. Thompson continued, would be significantly more than both your current jobs combined. And the hours would allow you to be home in the evenings. More silence. The fire crackled in the fireplace, and somewhere in the big house, a clock chimed 7 times. Why? Marie finally asked. Why would you offer this to a stranger? Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly. Because I believe in signs, Mrs. Williams, and finding our dog on New Year's Eve, brought home by a boy who gave up his own warmth to help an animal in need. Well, that feels like a sign to me. Mom, Thomas said quietly. He pulled the rent notice from his pocket and handed it to her. Marie unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. Her face fell as she read it, then hardened with determination. What are the hours? She asked. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of details. Salary discussions, schedule arrangements, benefits explanations. Thomas sat quietly, watching his mother's careful mask slowly crack as the reality of what was happening sank in. No more double shifts. No more coming home exhausted at midnight. No more missing his school events because she had to work. Of course, Mrs. Thompson was saying, we'll need references from your current employers, and there will be a background check. Standard procedure. I understand, Marie nodded. She looked younger somehow, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. We can start the paperwork next week, Mrs. Thompson continued. After the holiday, the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed again, 7:15. James, Mrs. Thompson turned to her husband. Is Robert ready with the car? I'll check. Mr. Thompson stepped out of the study. Marie stood up, smoothing her uniform with shaking hands. Thank you, she said softly. For everything. Don't thank me yet, Mrs. Thompson smiled. Wait until you see how much silver I have that needs polishing. A small laugh escaped Marie's lips, the first real smile Thomas had seen from her all evening. Thomas, Mrs. Thompson turned to him. Would you like to keep the scarf on Max for now? You can get it back when your mother starts work next week. Before Thomas could answer, Max jumped up and pressed against his legs, tail wagging furiously. I think that's a yes, Mrs. Thompson laughed. Mr. Thompson returned. Car's ready whenever you are. Thomas bent down to scratch Max's ears one last time. The dog licked his hand, still wearing the threadbare scarf like a badge of honor. As they followed Mr. Thompson through the massive house, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the desperate kind that kept them going day after day, but real, solid hope that things might actually get better. Outside, snow had started falling again. A sleek black car idled in the circular driveway, its exhaust creating clouds in the cold air. See you next week, Mrs. Thompson called from the doorway. Happy New Year! As they settled into the car's warm leather seats, Thomas looked at his mother. She was staring straight ahead, but tears glistened in her eyes. Mom, are you okay? She turned to him, reaching over to cup his face in her hands. You gave away your scarf, she whispered. It was just a scarf. No, she shook her head. It was kindness. And kindness just changed our lives. The car pulled away from the mansion, carrying them back toward their own world. But for the first time in years, that world didn't feel quite so heavy. The back seat of the Thompsons' car felt like another world. Thomas ran his hand over the smooth leather, watching snowflakes melt against the tinted windows. The driver, Robert, hadn't said a word since they'd started moving, but Thomas could see his eyes occasionally checking them in the rearview mirror. Turn left at the next light, please, Marie said quietly. Our building is the brick one with the green awning. Thomas watched their reflection in the window. His mother sat with her back straight, hands folded in her lap, still wearing her gas station uniform. The name tag was slightly crooked. The car pulled up to their building. The green awning was more gray than green now, and one of the lobby lights was flickering. It all looked smaller somehow after being in the Thompson mansion. "Thank you," Marie said to Robert. "We appreciate the ride." Robert nodded, finally speaking. "Mrs. Thompson asked me to give you this." He handed her a business card. "It has her personal cell number. She said to call if you need anything before next week." Marie took the card carefully, like it might burn her fingers. "Thank you." They climbed the 3 flights to their apartment in silence. The stairs creaked in all the familiar places. Mrs. Rodriguez's TV was too loud on the 2nd floor, and someone was cooking something with lots of garlic on the 3rd. Inside their apartment, Marie went straight to the kitchen and started unpacking the groceries. Thomas watched her pull out the containers the Thompsons' housekeeper had repacked everything in, sturdy glass ones with snap-on lids. Nothing like their mismatched plastic collection. "Mom?" She was arranging the apples in the fruit bowl, even though they both knew they'd be eaten by tomorrow. "Are you really going to take the job?" Her hands stilled on the fruit bowl. For a long moment, she just stood there, staring at the apples like they might hold some answer. "What do you think I should do?" Thomas blinked, surprised. His mother didn't usually ask his opinion on big decisions. "I think—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think Max led me there for a reason." Marie turned around, leaning against the counter. "You sound like Mrs. Thompson talking about signs." "But what if it is?" Thomas sat at their small kitchen table. "What if finding Max was supposed to happen? Life isn't usually that neat, baby." But she smiled slightly. "Though I have to admit, the timing is convenient." Thomas pulled the rent increase notice from his pocket and slid it across the table. Marie picked it up, reading it again, even though she'd already seen it at the Thompsons. "When were you going to tell me about this?" "Tomorrow," Thomas admitted. "I didn't want to ruin New Year's Eve." Marie sighed, sitting down across from him. "You shouldn't have to protect me from things like this. You protect me all the time." "That's different. I'm the parent, and I'm your son," Thomas said firmly. "We're supposed to help each other." Marie reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were rough from years of cleaning, but still gentle. "When did you get so wise? Must be all those lectures you give me." She laughed. A real laugh, not the tired one he usually heard. "Well, in that case, I should lecture you more often." The moment was interrupted by Thomas's phone buzzing. An unknown number flashed on the screen. "Hello, Thomas? It's Mrs. Thompson." Her voice was warm through the speaker. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "No, ma'am." He put the phone on speaker and set it on the table. "I wanted to ask, would you and your mother like to come over tomorrow afternoon? Nothing formal, just a small New Year's Day gathering. Max keeps looking for you, and I thought it might be nice for your mother to see the house in daylight before she starts work." Thomas looked at his mother. She was biting her lip, a sure sign she was nervous. "We wouldn't want to intrude on your family time," Marie started. "Nonsense," Mrs. Thompson cut in. "James's family is all in California, and Sarah, our daughter, is spending the holiday with her college roommate. It would just be us, Patricia, and a few close friends." Very casual. Marie's fingers tightened around Thomas's hand. "That's very kind of you," she said carefully. "Is that a yes?" Mrs. Thompson's smile was audible in her voice. "Yes," Thomas said before his mother could overthink it. "We'd love to come." "Wonderful. Shall we say around 2 o'clock? Robert can pick you up." "Oh, we couldn't ask Marie." Mrs. Thompson's voice was gentle but firm. "Let us do this. Please." Another squeeze of Thomas's hand, and then 2 o'clock would be perfect. "Thank you." After they hung up, Marie stared at the phone for a long moment. "What are we doing, Thomas? Having New Year's Day dinner with rich people?" She smiled despite herself. "You know what I mean. This morning I was worried about losing my job at the gas station. And now you have a better job," Thomas finished. "With normal hours and benefits and everything. It feels too good to be true. Maybe good things can just happen sometimes." Marie stood up and went back to the counter, pulling out ingredients for their much simpler New Year's Eve dinner. "Help me with the pasta?" They worked together in comfortable silence for a while, falling into their usual rhythm. Thomas chopped vegetables while his mother boiled water for the pasta. The small kitchen filled with familiar sounds and smells. "Tell me about Max again," Marie said as they sat down to eat. How exactly did you find him? So Thomas told the story again, this time including all the details he'd left out at the Thompsons. About counting coins, about wanting to just walk past the alley, about his father's voice in his head. Your father would be proud of you, Marie said softly when he finished. So proud. Do you think he'd be mad? That we're accepting help from rich people? Marie was quiet for a moment, twirling pasta around her fork. Your father had a lot of pride. Too much sometimes. But he also believed in doing what was best for family. And this feels like what's best for us. They finished eating and cleaned up together. The kitchen containers from the Thompsons gleamed on the counter, a small reminder of how much their lives had changed in just a few hours. We should get some sleep, Marie said, checking the time. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. Thomas hugged her tightly. She smelled like pasta sauce and the lavender lotion she always bought on sale. Love you, Mom. Love you more than anything, baby. In his room, Thomas lay awake for a long time, thinking about Max and the Thompsons and signs from the universe. His scarf was probably still wrapped around the little dog, keeping him warm in that big mansion. Just before he fell asleep, his phone buzzed one more time. A text from Mrs. Thompson. Max is sleeping with your scarf. I think he misses his hero. See you tomorrow. Red heart. Attached was a photo of Max curled up in what looked like a fancy dog bed, the worn blue scarf still wrapped around him like a security blanket. Thomas smiled in the darkness. Maybe his mother was right. Life wasn't usually neat and tidy like stories and books. But sometimes, just sometimes, it came pretty close. New Year's Day dawned bright and cold. Thomas woke to sunlight streaming through his window, making the fresh snow outside glitter like diamond dust. His phone showed 3 notifications: a Happy New Year text from Mrs. Chun, another photo of Max from Mrs. Thompson, and a reminder that Robert would pick them up at 1:45. The apartment smelled like coffee and toast. He found his mother in the kitchen, already dressed in her best pants and the blue sweater she saved for special occasions. You're up early, he said, grabbing a piece of toast. Couldn't sleep. Marie was organizing and reorganizing the same drawer she'd organized last night. Are you sure about this? About having dinner with the Thompsons? About all of it? She closed the drawer with more force than necessary. Maybe we should call and cancel. Say we're not feeling well. Thomas took a bite of toast, chewing slowly. Is this about the job or about going to their house today? Both. Neither. She sighed, finally stopping her nervous movement. I don't know how to act around people like that. Like what? People who love their dog so much they hire private security. That got a small smile. People with more money than we'll see in 10 lifetimes. Just be yourself, Thomas said. It worked yesterday. Yesterday was different. Yesterday was an emergency with their dog. Today is social. Thomas watched his mother fidget with her sweater sleeve. He'd never seen her this nervous, not even when she had to argue with the landlord about repairs. Mom, he waited until she looked at him. You clean rich people's houses all the time. That's different. That's work. I know what to do. What to say? This is... She gestured vaguely. This is sitting at their table, making conversation, pretending we belong there. We don't have to pretend anything. Mrs. Thompson invited us because she wants us there. Because of Max. Marie's hands finally stilled. Because of you, she corrected. Because you did the right thing. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of nervous energy. Marie cleaned the already clean apartment while Thomas tried to tame his hair into something presentable. At 1:30, they were both ready, standing in their small living room like they were waiting for a bus. Should we bring something? Marie asked suddenly. People usually bring something to dinner. I don't think we need to bring anything to a mansion. The intercom buzzed at exactly 1:45. Robert's voice crackled through the old speaker. Car for the Williams family. The drive felt shorter in daylight. Thomas watched the neighborhoods change again, from their familiar streets to the manicured lawns of Highland Avenue. The Thompson house looked different too, less intimidating somehow, with sunlight sparkling off the snow-covered trees. Max was waiting at the front door, still wearing Thomas's scarf. He barked excitedly as they got out of the car, tail wagging so hard his whole body shook. There's our hero! Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway, smiling warmly. She was wearing casual clothes, What rich people probably consider casual. Anyway, come in, come in. It's freezing out there. The house felt different in daylight, too. Sunlight streamed through huge windows, making everything glow. The pine and candle smell was still there, but now mixed with something that made Thomas's stomach growl. Patricia's been cooking since dawn, Mrs. Thompson explained, leading them through the house. She insists New Year's Day means a full spread. The kitchen was bigger than their entire apartment. Patricia stood at an island the size of Thomas's bedroom, directing two other staff members like a general commanding troops. Mrs. Williams. Thomas. She beamed at them. Perfect timing. The first batch of appetizers is just ready. Patricia. Marie started. Please call me Marie. Only if you call me Pat. The housekeeper winked. Here, try these. She handed them each a small plate with what looked like tiny pastries. Thomas bit into one and had to stop himself from grabbing 3 more immediately. They're good, right? Mr. Thompson appeared from another room, carrying Max. Pat's been making these for 20 years, and she still won't give me the recipe. Family secret, Patricia said firmly. Now shoo, all of you, out of my kitchen. Sarah just called. She'll be here in an hour. They moved to what Mrs. Thompson called the casual living room, though it was still fancier than anywhere Thomas had ever been. Max immediately jumped from Mr. Thompson's arms and planted himself in Thomas's lap. He really has missed you, Mrs. Thompson laughed. Slept with that scarf all night. Marie sat carefully on the edge of the sofa, still looking like she might bolt at any moment. Mrs. Thompson must have noticed because she immediately started asking questions about their neighborhood, their favorite restaurants, places they liked to go. Slowly, Thomas watched his mother begin to relax. She talked about the Korean restaurant around the corner from their apartment, the owner who always gave Thomas extra dumplings. About the library where she used to take him after school when he was little, before she had to start working 2 jobs. And what about you, Thomas? Mr. Thompson asked. What do you like to do? I read a lot, he said, scratching behind Max's ears. And I help Mrs. Chun at the grocery store sometimes, stocking shelves and stuff. Do you get paid for that? James, Mrs. Thompson said sharply. No, it's relevant. He held up a hand. Thomas, do you like working? Thomas thought about it. I like helping people, and I like earning money to help Mom with bills and stuff. Marie made a small sound, but Mr. Thompson was nodding. Sarah, our daughter, she's never worked a day in her life, he said. Not because we wouldn't let her, but because she never had to. Sometimes I wonder if we did her a disservice. You gave her opportunities, Marie said quietly. That's what parents are supposed to do. True, Mrs. Thompson agreed. But you've given Thomas something just as valuable. You've taught him responsibility, compassion, the value of hard work, and how to rescue lost dogs, Mr. Thompson added with a smile. More staff appeared with plates of food, things Thomas had never seen before, fancy versions of normal dishes. Max stayed firmly in his lap, even when Patricia brought out what she called his regular lunch. Actually, Mrs. Thompson set down her plate. We wanted to discuss something with you both. James? Mr. Thompson straightened in his chair. Marie, we know you're planning to start work next week as our housekeeper. But after talking it over last night, we'd like to propose something different. Thomas felt his mother tense beside him. Different how? We'd like to offer you a position as our household manager, Mrs. Thompson said. You'd be in charge of all household staff, scheduling, ordering supplies, organizing events, essentially running the entire household operation. Marie's hands twisted in her lap. I've never done anything like that. But you have, Mr. Thompson countered. You've managed 2 jobs, raised a son alone, kept a household running on a tight budget. That takes incredible organizational skills and determination. The salary would be significantly higher than what we discussed yesterday, Mrs. Thompson added. And you'd have your own office here in the house. Thomas watched his mother's face, seeing the emotions play across it. Hope, fear, pride, uncertainty. Why? She asked again, just like yesterday. Why would you trust me with all that? Mrs. Thompson leaned forward. Because in less than 24 hours, we've learned more about your character than we could from any resume. Your son's actions yesterday told us everything we need to know about how you've raised him. And that tells us everything we need to know about you. Marie was quiet for a long moment. The grandfather clock ticked in the hallway, and Max snored softly in Thomas's lap. Could I think about it? Of course, Mrs. Thompson smiled. Take all the time you need. The position is yours if you want it. Just then, the front door opened, and a voice called out, Mom? Dad? Is everyone here? A young woman burst into the room, bringing a wave of cold air with her. She was maybe college age, with Mrs. Thompson's features and Mr. Thompson's confident stance. Sarah. Mrs. Thompson stood to hug her daughter. I thought you weren't coming until later. Change my plans. Couldn't miss meeting the dog rescuer, could I? She turned to Thomas with a grin. That's you, right? The one who saved Max? Thomas nodded, suddenly shy. Well, you're officially my hero. I got him for Christmas last year, and I was so scared when he got out. She knelt down to pet Max, who finally left Thomas's lap to greet her. Still wearing the famous scarf? I see. Oh. Thomas reached for the scarf. You can have it back now. Keep it on him, Sarah said. It suits him. Besides, Mom already ordered you a new one. Much warmer. Thomas looked at Mrs. Thompson, who shrugged. It should be delivered tomorrow. Consider it a late Christmas present. Marie started to protest, but Mrs. Thompson held up a hand. Marie, if you're going to work here in whatever capacity you choose, you're going to have to get used to us doing nice things. We take care of our people. Speaking of which, Sarah jumped up. Mom, where are those amazing little pastry things Pat always makes? The conversation shifted to food and holiday traditions. Thomas watched his mother slowly begin to participate more, telling stories about their own New Year's traditions, laughing at Sarah's college adventures. By the time dessert was served, something French that Thomas couldn't pronounce, but tasted like heaven, Marie was sitting back comfortably on the sofa, and Max had settled into a spot between her and Thomas, still wearing the scarf like a badge of honor. Looking around the room, at these two very different families somehow fitting together, Thomas thought about signs and chances in doing the right thing. Maybe life wasn't usually neat and tidy like stories in books. But sometimes, just sometimes, it was even better. The first Monday after New Year's, Marie stood in front of their bathroom mirror, adjusting her new blazer. Mrs. Thompson had insisted on taking her shopping the day before, calling it a work necessity. The price tags had made Marie's hands shake, but Mrs. Thompson, please call me Sarah, wouldn't take no for an answer. Mom? Thomas called from the kitchen. Breakfast is ready. She found him at the stove, carefully flipping pancakes. Another of Mrs. Thompson's gifts sat on the counter, a proper electric griddle to replace their worn-out frying pan. You didn't have to cook, Marie said, but her smile gave her away. First day of your new job, Thomas shrugged. Had to do something special. They ate together at their small kitchen table, the January sun painting strips of light across the scratched surface. Marie cut her pancakes into neat squares, a habit she'd had as long as Thomas could remember. Nervous? He asked. Terrified? She set down her fork. What if I can't do this, Thomas? What if I'm not qualified to manage an entire household? Mrs. Thompson thinks you are. Mrs. Thompson is? Marie paused, searching for the right words. She's very optimistic. She's smart, Thomas countered. And she's right about you. A horn sounded outside. 2 short beeps. Robert, right on time. Marie stood up, smoothing her blazer again. You'll be okay getting to school? Mom? Thomas gave her a look. I'm 11. I've been getting myself to school for 2 years. I know. She grabbed her new leather bag, another work necessity according to Mrs. Thompson. It's just different now. Different is good, Thomas said, standing to hug her. Have a great first day. The Thompson house looked different in the crisp morning light. Staff cars filled the circular driveway, and people moved purposefully in and out of the service entrance. Marie's hands shook slightly as Robert opened the car door for her. Good morning, Mrs. Williams. Patricia greeted her at the door. Ready for the grand tour? The next hour was a whirlwind of introductions and information. There were 12 full-time staff members, Patricia explained, plus part-time workers for special events. Marie took careful notes in the leather-bound notebook Mrs. Thompson had given her, trying to remember names and roles and responsibilities. And this, Patricia said finally, opening a door on the second floor, is your office. Marie stopped in the doorway, stunned. The room was bigger than Thomas's bedroom, with a large desk facing windows that overlooked the garden. A state-of-the-art computer sat on the desk, along with a framed photo she recognized from her phone, Thomas with Max on New Year's Day. both looking happy and relaxed. Mrs. Thompson had it developed yesterday, Patricia explained, nodding at the photo. She thought you might want something personal in here. It's too much, Marie whispered. It's exactly enough, Mrs. Thompson's voice came from behind them. Good morning, Marie. How are you feeling? Overwhelmed, Marie admitted. But ready to learn? That's exactly the right attitude. Mrs. Thompson smiled. Now, shall we go over your first tasks? The morning passed in a blur of schedules and staff meetings. Marie's head spun with information about meal planning, maintenance schedules, and event coordination. But underneath the nervousness, she felt something else: excitement. This was challenging work, but work she could do. At noon, Patricia knocked on her office door. Lunch break, she announced. No arguments. They ate in the staff dining room, a bright, comfortable space off the main kitchen. The other staff members included Marie in their conversations easily, asking about Thomas and sharing stories about their own families. He's quite the celebrity around here, the head gardener Joe grinned. The boy who saved Max. Speaking of Max, Mrs. Thompson appeared in the doorway. Marie, could you come with me for a moment? They found Max in the main living room, curled up in his bed. He was still wearing Thomas's scarf, though it had been carefully washed and mended. He misses Thomas, Mrs. Thompson said softly. Would you mind if we sent Robert to pick him up after school sometimes? Max could use the company, and we have that whole library upstairs where Thomas could do his homework. Marie thought about Thomas coming home to their empty apartment every afternoon. You're sure it wouldn't be an imposition? Marie. Mrs. Thompson turned to face her. When are you going to realize that we genuinely want both of you in our lives? This isn't charity or obligation. Your son brought our dog home, yes, but he also brought something else, a reminder of what really matters. Kindness, integrity, family. Marie blinked hard against sudden tears. I'm not used to people being so kind. Real, Marie finished. Everyone has an angle, usually. Everyone wants something. We do want something, Mrs. Thompson said. We want you to succeed here. We want Thomas to have a safe place to spend his afternoons. We want Max to be happy. And we want to know that sometimes doing the right thing really does change lives. Marie's phone buzzed, a text from Thomas. Hope your first day is going great. Mrs. Chun gave me extra dumplings for lunch and says to tell you she's proud of you. Speaking of lunch, Mrs. Thompson said, reading the text upside down, we should get back to work. But think about the after-school thing. Max would really love it. The afternoon brought more training, more introductions, more systems to learn. By the time Robert drove her home, Marie's feet ached and her head was full, but she felt good, really good. She found Thomas at their kitchen table, doing homework. The apartment smelled like the dumplings Mrs. Chen always made on Mondays. Mom! He jumped up to hug her. How was it? Amazing, she said, surprised to find she meant it. Overwhelming and terrifying and amazing. Tell me everything. So they sat at their small table, sharing leftover dumplings, and Marie told him about her day. About her office with the garden view. About the staff who welcomed her so warmly. About Max still wearing his scarf. Mrs. Thompson asked if you'd like to come do your homework there sometimes, she said carefully. After school. Max misses you. Thomas's face lit up. Really? I could see Max? Only if you want to. And only on days when you don't have other things to do. I want to, he said quickly. Then, more cautiously, is it really okay? Us being in their house so much. Marie thought about Mrs. Thompson's words about kindness and family. About the photo on her new desk. About Max in his bed, still wearing a worn blue scarf like a treasured possession. Yeah, she said softly. I think it really is. Later that night, after Thomas was in bed, Marie sat at their kitchen table looking at the day's notes. Her new job title was written at the top of the first page, Household Manager. Below it, she'd written dozens of tasks and responsibilities. It should have been overwhelming. It should have felt impossible. Instead, it felt like putting on a coat that had been waiting for her all along. Unexpected, but somehow exactly right. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson. Great first day. The staff already loves you. See you tomorrow, Household Manager. Marie smiled, running her fingers over her new business cards. Maybe Thomas was right. Maybe different really was good. Outside their window, snow began to fall again. adding fresh white to the gray city streets. In the Thompson mansion across town, a small dog slept soundly, wrapped in a worn blue scarf that smelled like kindness and new beginnings. The moving truck looked too big for their small collection of belongings. 2 weeks had passed since Marie's first day at the Thompsons, and now they stood on the sidewalk, watching movers carry boxes from their old apartment. "Is that everything?" the head mover asked, holding his clipboard. Marie looked at their life packed into boxes and bags. "Almost. Just need to do one final check." The new apartment was only 10 blocks away, still in their neighborhood, but in a better-maintained building. Mrs. Thompson had offered to help them find a place in Highland Avenue, but Marie had been firm. They needed to stay in their community. "Come on." Marie touched Thomas's shoulder. "Let's say goodbye to the old place." They climbed the familiar stairs one last time. The empty apartment echoed with their footsteps. Patches of cleaner paint showed where pictures had hung, and the worn spot in the carpet seemed more obvious without furniture hiding it. "Feels smaller," Thomas said, standing in his old bedroom. "Everything feels smaller when you're leaving it behind." They checked each room, opening cabinets and closets. In the kitchen, Thomas found a forgotten mug behind the sink. In the bathroom, Marie discovered an old bottle of shampoo. "Ready?" she asked finally. Thomas took one last look around. "Ready?" The new apartment was on the 4th floor of a red brick building with a working elevator and hallways that smelled like fresh paint instead of old carpet. Their furniture looked different in the larger rooms, like it could finally breathe. "Thomas," a voice called as they unloaded boxes. "Need any help?" Mrs. Chun stood on the sidewalk, holding a large paper bag that smelled like her famous dumplings. "Just thought you might want lunch," she smiled, handing Marie the bag. "Moving is hungry work." The three of them sat on boxes in what would be the living room, eating dumplings and talking about the neighborhood. Mrs. Chin's store was actually closer to their new apartment, she pointed out, and the library, and Thomas's school. "Change is good," Mrs. Chun said as she left. "But I'm glad you're staying close by." By evening, most of the boxes were unpacked. The kitchen actually had enough cabinets for all their dishes, and Thomas's new room had a window seat where he could read. "Mom," he called from the bathroom. "The hot water works. Like really works." Marie laughed, unpacking books onto their old shelf. Her phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Thompson. "How's the moving going? Don't forget, no work tomorrow. Take the weekend to settle in." Another text followed quickly. P.S. Max says hi. Still wearing the scarf, even though it's warm out. The next morning, Thomas walked into the kitchen and stopped. Sunlight streamed through windows that actually sealed properly against the cold. The new refrigerator hummed quietly, covered in the same familiar photos and notes, but something was different. "Mom?" Marie was at the stove, making breakfast. "Are you whistling?" She paused, realizing she had been. "Guess I am. You seem happy." "I am happy." She slid eggs onto plates, real eggs, not the powdered kind they used to buy on sale. "Aren't you?" Thomas thought about it, about his new window seat and the working hot water, about spending afternoons at the Thompsons with Max, doing homework in their library while his mom managed the household, about not having to count coins for groceries anymore. "Yeah," he said, "I really am." His first day back at school after the move, Thomas noticed the differences immediately. He had a real lunch in his backpack, not just whatever they could afford that week. His winter coat was new, a gift from the Thompsons that Marie had finally accepted after 3 days of protests. "Looking good, Thomas?" Mrs. Rodriguez, his math teacher, smiled as he walked into class. She'd been his mother's biggest supporter when Marie first took the job with the Thompsons. "How's the new apartment?" "It's great. We can actually use the shower without the pipes making weird noises." At lunch, he sat with his usual friends, but something felt different. Not because of his new coat or full lunchbox, but because he felt different. Lighter somehow. "Hey, is it true?" Jake asked between bites of sandwich. "That you rescued some rich person's dog, and now your mom works for them?" "Yeah," Thomas nodded. "But it's not like that. They're good people." After school, Robert waited in the Thompsons' car. It was Thomas's designated Max visiting day, and the little dog was already at the front door when they arrived, scarf slightly crooked but still proudly worn. "There's my favorite study buddy," Sarah Thompson grinned from the doorway. She was home from college for a long weekend. "Ready to tackle that math homework?" They settled in the library, Thomas at the big table, Max curled up on a special cushion nearby, Sarah sprawled in an armchair with her own textbooks. "How's the new place?" she asked, highlighting something in her book. "Really good. Everything works, and I have this cool window seat in my room. Window seats are the best for reading, or thinking, or just watching the world go by." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, broken only by Max's occasional snores and the scratch of pencils on paper. "Thomas," Sarah set down her highlighter. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up from his math problems. "Sure. That day you found Max, you could have just walked away. Most people would have. Why didn't you?" Thomas thought about that moment in the alley, about the cold and the grocery bags and all the reasons to keep walking. "My dad used to say that character is what you do when nobody's watching," he said finally. "And maybe nobody was watching, but I would have known. You know." Sarah smiled softly. "Yeah, I know exactly what you mean." Later, Thomas found his mother in her office, going over plans for some charity event the Thompsons were hosting. She looked different here, confident, in charge, like she'd been doing this job her whole life. "Ready to head home?" she asked, closing her laptop. On their way out, they passed Mrs. Thompson in the hallway. "Oh, Marie, don't forget, the contractors are coming tomorrow to check the East Wing heating system." And Thomas, Patricia made extra cookies. "Take some home?" Outside, the February air was crisp but not bitter. Their new apartment was a 15-minute walk away, but Robert insisted on driving them anyway. "It's my job," he'd say whenever Marie protested. "Besides, I like having someone to talk to besides the GPS." At home, and their new apartment really felt like home now. Thomas sat at his window seat, watching the city lights come on. His homework was done, his stomach was full of Patricia's cookies, and somewhere in a mansion across town, a little dog was falling asleep wearing a worn blue scarf. "Penny for your thoughts?" Marie sat beside him, 2 mugs of hot chocolate in her hands. "Just thinking about how different everything is now." He took one of the mugs. "Good different. Very good different," she agreed. They sat together, watching the lights and drinking hot chocolate that didn't come from a mix. In just over a month, their whole world had shifted. Not because of luck or magic or even kindness alone, but because of a choice made in a cold alley on New Year's Eve. Character is what you do when nobody's watching. But sometimes, Thomas thought, character is also what changes everything after someone finally sees you. 1 month later, New Year's Eve, Thomas stood in the Thompsons' kitchen, watching Patricia direct her staff with her usual military precision. The whole house smelled like baking and pine needles, just like it had a year ago, but everything else was different. "Thomas, taste this." Patricia held out a spoon. "Does it need more salt?" He tasted the sauce carefully. "Maybe a tiny bit, but it's really good." "This boy," Patricia turned to her staff, "has better taste buds than half the food critics in New York. A tiny bit more salt it is." In the main hall, Marie was coordinating last-minute details for the Thompsons' New Year's Eve party. Her voice carried clearly as she directed the setup crew. The ice sculpture goes by the east window, away from the heating vents. James, Mr. Thompson, wants the band set up in the corner by the grand staircase. And remember, we need clear paths to all the exits. Thomas smiled, remembering how nervous she'd been on her first day. Now she ran the household like she'd been born to do it. "Your mom's amazing," Sarah said. Appearing beside him with Max in her arms, the dog still wore the blue scarf, though Mrs. Thompson had secretly bought Thomas a half-dozen new ones. "She's got everyone working like a well-oiled machine." "She always did," Thomas replied. "Just on a smaller scale before." The doorbell rang, and Thomas heard his mother greeting the first guests. The party wasn't starting for hours, but there was a special early gathering, one Marie had planned herself. "Come on," Sarah nudged him. "Time to get ready." In his designated room upstairs, he still couldn't believe he had his own room in the mansion. Thomas changed into the new suit Mrs. Thompson had insisted on buying him. It felt strange, but good strange, like everything else about this new life. When he came back downstairs, the entrance hall had filled with familiar faces. Mrs. Chun stood chatting with Joe the gardener. His math teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was admiring the Christmas tree with Robert. Even his old neighbor, Mr. Peterson from the gas station, had come. "There he is," Mrs. Thompson called out. "The guest of honor." Thomas felt his face heat up. "Mom, what's going on?" Marie appeared beside him, wearing a deep blue dress that matched his suit. Well, we couldn't let today pass without marking it somehow. It's been exactly 1 year since you found Max. 1 year since everything changed, Mrs. Thompson added. But Thomas looked around at all the faces. Why is everyone here? Because everyone here is part of the story, Marie explained. Part of our story. Mrs. Chun stepped forward. I remember you counting out coins for groceries that day. Such a responsible young man. And I remember you running into my math class the next week, so excited about your mom's new job. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. And I remember feeling terrible about closing the gas station, Mr. Peterson added. But look what came out of it. Max barked from his spot in Sarah's arms, making everyone laugh. Even Max remembers, Sarah grinned. Though he mostly remembers getting a stylish scarf out of the deal. We wanted to gather everyone together, Mrs. Thompson explained, to celebrate not just the new year, but the power of small choices. One boy, one dog, one cold evening. And look how many lives were touched. Thomas felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, steady and strong. Speech, Sarah called out, and others joined in. Speech. Oh no, Thomas shook his head. I didn't do anything special. I just did the right thing, his mother finished. Which is the most special thing of all. Patricia appeared with trays of appetizers, including the little pastries Thomas had tasted that first day. Staff members passed out champagne glasses filled with sparkling cider. A toast. Mr. Thompson raised his glass. To Thomas and Max, proof that kindness still changes the world, one small choice at a time. To Thomas and Max, everyone echoed. Later, after the early gathering had merged into the main party, Thomas sat in his favorite library spot with Max. The dog's head rested on his lap, the blue scarf slightly crooked but still proudly worn. There you are, Marie said, finding them in their quiet corner. Taking a break from the crowd? Just thinking. He stroked Max's ears. Did you plan all this? The early party? It was Mrs. Thompson's idea, actually. She wanted to mark the anniversary, somehow. Marie sat beside him. Are you okay? I know you don't like being the center of attention. I'm good. And he was really... It's just strange, thinking about last year. About finding Max. About everything that happened after. Life changes fast sometimes. Yeah, but this is different. It's like... He searched for the words. It's like finding Max was just the beginning. Like it opened a door we didn't even know was there. Marie looked at her son, really looked at him. He sat straighter now, wore confidence like a comfortable coat. The worry lines that no 11-year-old should have had faded from around his eyes. You know what I'm most proud of? She said softly. That I helped Max? That you stayed exactly who you are. She squeezed his hand. All this change, all these new things, but you're still my Thomas. Still the boy who gives away his scarf on a cold night. From downstairs came the sound of the band starting up. The main party would be in full swing now, the mansion filling with the Thompsons' friends and business associates. We should probably go down, Thomas said. You have to make sure everything runs smoothly. Actually, Marie smiled. I gave most of the staff the night off. Mrs. Thompson's orders said this night was for family. Family? Apparently, that's us now too. She stood up, straightening her dress. Come on. Sarah's saving us seats for the fireworks later. They made their way downstairs, Max trotting beside them. The main hall glittered with lights and laughter. Mrs. Thompson waved from across the room, while Sarah beckoned them toward the back patio where chairs were set up for the midnight fireworks. Oh good, you found them. Mrs. Thompson hurried over. Marie, James wants to introduce you to some people. And Thomas, Sarah's friend, just brought over some ridiculous board game she swears we all need to play. Go ahead, Mom. Thomas nodded. I'll be with Sarah. He watched his mother move confidently through the crowd, stopping to give instructions to staff members, chatting easily with guests. She belonged here now, but not because she'd changed who she was. She just finally found a place that saw her true value. The night grew colder as midnight approached. Thomas sat between Sarah and Mrs. Thompson on the back patio, wrapped in a warm blanket, Max curled up at his feet. His mother sat on Mrs. Thompson's other side, laughing at something Mr. Thompson was saying. 10 seconds, someone called out. The countdown began. Thomas looked up at the stars, remembering another cold night 1 year ago. Remembered counting coins, carrying groceries, hearing a whimper in an alley. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The sky exploded with color. Max barked excitedly, his blue scarf glowing in the flickering light. Mrs. Thompson hugged Sarah, then Thomas, then Marie. "Happy New Year," she said softly. "And happy anniversary." Thomas felt Max press against his legs, warm and solid and real. The dog looked up at him with those same brown eyes that had peered out from behind a dumpster 1 year ago. Character is what you do when nobody's watching. But sometimes, Thomas thought, watching the fireworks paint the sky in brilliant colors. Character is also what builds bridges between worlds. What turns strangers into family. What transforms a simple scarf into a symbol of everything good and true. "Happy New Year, Max," he whispered, scratching behind the dog's ears. Max's tail thumped against the patio stones, still wearing the scarf that had started it all. Above them, the fireworks continued to burst and fade, each one a celebration of endings and beginnings, of small choices and big changes, of the infinite possibilities that could spring from a single act of kindness on a cold winter night.